Why don't we go ahead and get started? I got my mic on, if that's okay. Yeah. So thank you all for joining us today. We've got a great discussion, a book talk, and a lineup here that is sure to engage some critical thinking skills and some empirical analysis of interesting events in South Asia. So we're here for this book, Secession and Security, Explaining State Strategy Against Separatists by Ahsan Butt. And today we'll probably spend a little more time focusing on the South Asia cases, but of course his work is a theoretical work that sort of has implications and empirical traction in a lot of cases around the world. And we're also joined by a couple other discussants, Tamanna Salikuddin and Alec Worsnop. I'm really pleased that we have such a great lineup here today. I'll mention that Ahsan is also now a non-resident fellow with our South Asia program here at the Stimpson Center in the effort to sort of beef up our credentials, and Ahsan adds a lot of weight to our ledger. At the end of the event, we will have copies of Ahsan's book available for purchase. I think it's you're getting a cut rate here as opposed to buying it online. So if any of you are really piqued by the arguments and ideas here, feel free to make a purchase after. You can do it with either exact cash or with a credit card. Just a couple of housekeeping rules real quick. If you can turn your cell phones off to silence, we don't have any disruptions during the event. And to our audience that's watching online, and for those here today, if you want to tweet about this, you can tweet with the hashtag StimpsonNow to discuss the event and continue the conversation. We'll keep them all together. So I asked Ahsan to come give a talk today on his book. It was launched recently, but it seems really relevant to sort of a lot of contemporary debates going on within South Asia. Certainly the discussion of secessionism and security issues is one that really animates the India-Pakistan competition, and it's a large part of our portfolio here at the South Asia program at Stimpson. And it has to do a lot with sort of the just vast number of insurgencies or rebellions that existed on the subcontinent since partition in 1947, and even prior to that. And a lot of these have been ethnic nationalist movements. A lot of them have been secessionist in nature, but there's some very interesting variation in outcomes, or at least in sort of the intensity of these conflicts. And I think that's what Ahsan has sunk his teeth into, is to try to explain some of that variation, where some conflicts end in or result in some very bloody encounters with the state, and other ones can either get resolved a little more peacefully or at least with far less intensity. And so that variation is a puzzle that I think has motivated a lot of academics, and Ahsan's done a fantastic job in tackling that with his book here today. So I'm just going to introduce him briefly. Ahsan's going to give a talk for about 25 minutes to sort of unpack some of the arguments in the book. And then we'll have a couple discussants come up here, and then I'll introduce them as well, and we'll talk through some of the strengths and weaknesses of the book, and then open up to Q&A for a discussion on its relevant to a lot of issues that we're dealing with today. So Ahsan Butt is an assistant professor at the School of Public Policy and Government at George Mason University, and he's also, as I mentioned, a non-resident fellow here at the Stimpson Center. His research focuses on nationalism, security, international order in South Asia. His first book, Secession and Security, Explaining State Strategy Against Separatists, is a topic of discussion today, and was published by Cornell University Press a few months ago in November of 2017. So with that, I'll introduce Ahsan to come up here and give us a talk, and we'll go from there. Thank you.
Hello. Okay, perfect. Let's see if this works. Perfect. Well, thanks for that introduction, Samir. And thanks to Samir and Hamza for arranging this logistically. And thanks to all of you for showing up today. I really appreciate it. I'm going to be talking, as Samir mentioned, about the book that I wrote that was just released, Secession and Security, Explaining State Strategy Against Separatists. So the reason I wrote this book is that separatist wars are very common. Since the end of World War II, there have been twice as many separatist wars or nationalist civil wars as interstate wars in the system. And it's not just that the separatist wars are very common, it's that they're very deadly. Separatist wars, on average, tend to last longer than ideological civil wars. They tend to be more lethal than ideological civil wars, which leads some scholars to suggest that separatist conflicts are the chief source of violence in the world today. Now, such separatist conflicts result from a simple incongruity, which is that you have ethnic groups or national groups demanding autonomy or statehood on territory that a state is unwilling to give it up, right? But interestingly, not all separatist claims result in violent denial by the state. Oftentimes, states will negotiate peacefully with the separatist movement and give them concessions up to and including independence. So the obvious question then becomes, why are some separatist movements dealt with repression while others win negotiated concessions? And then of those movements that are dealt with repression, why are some targets of especially harsh violence? In other words, what explains state strategy against separatists? I hope to convince you today that external security holds the key to answering this question, that external security concerns explain both whether states will coerce separatists, as well as how much they will coerce separatists. This external security argument stands in stark contrast to the existing literature, which focuses mainly on domestic factors. I can talk more in the Q&A about what the existing literature says. I won't get into it in any depth right now. But suffice it to say, they focus mostly on domestic factors, and I'm bringing the international environment into the equation. So to understand why security is a big concern during secessionist crises, we might want to step back and understand what is actually going on during secession. When secession happens, what is actually happening? And I argue in the book that secession, more than anything else, represents a large and rapid shift in the balance of power against the state experiencing it. The state loses relative power to not one, but loses power relative to not one, but two actors, right? The first actor that the state loses relative power to is the secessionists themselves. Previously, this was the mere ethnic group within a state. Now it has a state of its own, which means that it has won the military, economic, demographic, and institutional benefits of statehood, which allow it to catch up on a relative scale to the state. It may not catch up on an absolute level, but it certainly catches up on a relative level and becomes a peer competitor of its former host state. The second actor that the state loses relative power to is existing rivals, either in the region or the wider globe. The reason that the state loses relative power to this set of actors is because secession, by definition, means you're losing territory and population. And territory and population in the international relations and security studies literature are two major indices of national power. So by definition, if you're losing territory and population, it means you're losing power. So the state is losing relative power to two sets of actors anytime secession occurs. Now, the reason losses in relative power matter is because after the border change or after secession has taken place, the state may face war. The state may face war against this new neighbor, right, the newly created state on its border, right, in which case, for example, you might have the case of Ethiopia fighting Eritrea in the late 1990s, a mere 4 years after Eritrea became independent. Or you might face a war against an existing rival, as Pakistan and India faced off in a war a quarter century after Pakistan lost East Pakistan, became Bangladesh. Now, the reason these wars are scary and the reason these wars cast a shadow over decision-making during secessionist crises is because no actor wants to face such a war in a weakened position. And as I just argued, secession by definition weakens you relative to your rivals, right? So the question really is, the question states really have to ask themselves is, where is this all heading, right? Where is this all going to lead? And what I argue is that only confident states, only secure states, only sanguine states should attempt concessions. The reason that only confident and sanguine states should attempt concessions is because granting concessions short of independence, such as giving territorial autonomy, can lead to a slippery slope where the ethnic group or the national group comes back and demands greater goods or more autonomy based in part on the concessions you just granted them, right? So the political resources, the administrative resources, the economic and social resources that ethnic and national groups gather with the winning of autonomy can often help propel more strident, more vociferous demands in the future. And so only states who are prepared to give up the entire territory should go down the road of concessions. And in turn, the only states that should be comfortable enough with giving up the entire territory are states that are comfortable, secure, sanguine states. By contrast, if you're an insecure state or a fearful state, right, concessions are a bad idea. Right? That's where the state will, I argue, repress the secessionists and not allow a border change because that's going to impact their security in the future. So I'm not going to get into any great depth of how states make these judgments of whether they're an insecure state or a sanguine state in this presentation. I'm happy to talk in the Q&A. But essentially what I do in the book is I make this stark distinction between, as I said, insecure, fearful states and secure, confident, sanguine states, right? This is one of the main independent variables is sort of driving the analysis. And the state has to make a judgment in the theoretical framework. The state has to make a judgment whether they're going to face future war against the secessionists and or face a future war against existing rivals, okay? A war, if the state judges war likely against either one of these actors, doesn't have to be both, just either one of these actors, the state considers itself insecure and fearful. On the other hand, if the state considers war unlikely against both sets of actors, that's when the state considers itself confident, secure, sanguine. So as I said, I'm not going to get into the theory in depth right now. We can talk more in the Q&A. But essentially, when it comes to the seceded state, right, the question I'm asking is, are the decision makers echoing what William Seward, Secretary of State for the Union in the U.S. Civil War, was saying when discussing the prospect of a southern U.S. state, an independent South, a confederacy, where he's saying, look, if this state comes into being, it's going to have to expand west and north and south, and how can we be expected to remain at peace with this country, right? That's just not going to happen. So our decision makers casting their minds in the future and thinking, well, we're going to have to face a war against this new state. Conversely, you might also think, well, are we going to be facing war against existing rivals? And here, the proxy that I employ is how war-prone is the particular region that the state is in. Just as it is with people and human beings, so it is with states. Some neighborhoods are better to live in than others. And those states that are in bad neighborhoods, in war-prone neighborhoods, in dangerous neighborhoods, where militarization and predation and aggression is sort of normal and typical, states in those regions cannot be sanguine, right? Where states in parts of the world where war just doesn't happen anymore, right? What I call a post-security environment, that's where states can start thinking, well, it's not a big deal. So this really is the first big node in the theory, right? This is the node in the theory that's distinguishing between states that are coercing separatists and states that are saying, sure, let's talk, right? If the state deems future war likely against either the seceded state or existing rivals, or both, then it deems border changes unacceptable, and that is a sufficient condition for the state to coerce the separatists and say, you're not going anywhere, right? Whereas if the state deems future war unlikely against both the separatists and the new state, and border changes just aren't that big a deal, that's where border changes become acceptable, and the state says, sure, let's talk, right? And if you want to go, you can go. Yeah. So then we get to the second independent variable. Once the state has made a judgment that it's going to be coercing the separatists and not letting them go without a fight anyway, right? That's where the second independent variable of third-party support comes into the equation. Third-party support, in my theory, dictates how repressive and how harsh the state is going to be. In any secessionist crisis, external rivals of the state will step in, or can step in, to help and aid the separatist movement achieve its goals. They can do this because they want the territory for themselves, right? That's what we call irredentism. They can do this because they have some sort of ethnic affinity with the group seeking separation, right? Or they can do this for domestic political calculations, right? I have no strong views on why third parties get involved, right? But I do have strong views on what happens once third parties get involved, right? And what I argue is that third-party support, escalating third-party support, results in harsher state responses and harsher state strategies against separatists for a couple of reasons. One is a material logic. Simply put, the more help an outside group gives to a separatist movement, the stronger that movement is militarily, and the stronger that movement is, the more violence is required to defeat it, okay? So that's one point. Secondly, there's an emotional, affective angle or aspect to this situation. Scholars of ethnic conflict are very clear that you cannot divorce, as much as scholars would like to in their laboratories, right, you cannot divorce questions of emotion from questions of ethnic conflict. It's deeply intertwined. But one emotion that hasn't come up a lot in the literature on ethnic conflict is betrayal. And secession sort of conjures up these images of betrayal as it is, right? Oh, you're leaving us. Like that's betrayal, right? But those feelings are exacerbated when the separatists get into bed with an external enemy, right? Because it's bad enough that you're seeking a divorce, but it's even worse that you're sleeping with my worst enemy while you're seeking a divorce, right? So that's just not on. And that results in very angry leaders and very angry security forces on the ground, and that's where we start getting extremely indiscriminate violence. Okay, so third-party support has basically three possible values in my theory: limited, moderate, and high. Limit is when, first of all you're doing is talking, right? Talking doesn't really help that much. A little bit more help, but still limited, is when you're giving money. And then finally, the highest form of limited support is a sanctuary across the border. Okay. Once we step up to what I call moderate levels, that's where the state starts getting seriously involved. This is where military aid comes into the equation, especially because a lot of times these separatist groups are a bunch of ragtag rebels who don't really know what they're doing. But 5 or 6 weeks in a training camp from an outside state, and suddenly you're starting to get a real fighting force. So whether we're talking about military equipment, military training, military supplies, those are the types of things that qualify as moderate third-party support. And then finally, the highest form of third-party support is where the state literally fights alongside separatists with its own soldiers or irregular forces. Okay. So this then leads us to the dependent variable, which is state strategy against separatists. Remember, I'm trying to explain why states are dealing with separatists differently. Okay. And what I argue is that if you have a low probability of war, this is that sort of left-hand side of that graph I first showed you a couple of slides ago, that's where the state has the room for maneuver for what I call a negotiation and concession strategy. Here the state is taking violence completely off the table. Okay? There's no question of possible violence. The state may still say, look, we don't want you to leave, right? So let's talk, and maybe I give you some goodies. Maybe you get to speak your own language in schools. Maybe you keep your own more of your tax revenue if you're a rich part of the country, or we give you more aid if you're a poor part of the country. So cultural autonomy, economic autonomy, political autonomy, whatever, you're trying to essentially buy off the separatists and say, look, please don't go, right? We like having you here, please don't go, okay? And this can result in one of two outcomes. The separatists can say, that's a good deal, we'll take it, okay, and we'll stick around. So the Quebecois or the Scots, for instance, right? We'll take it, we'll stick around. Or the separatists could say, you know what, that's not good enough. We still want to leave. So this is the Czechoslovakia case, right? Where Slovakia says, we're out, okay? But the point is, there's no question of violence, right? Violence is completely off the table, right? This is in stark contrast to what happens on the right-hand side of that graph, right? When there's a high probability of war, that's where the state says, you're not going anywhere. And the harshness of its response is dictated by how much third-party support there is. So when you have what I call limited third-party support, that's where the state employs policing. This is a coercive strategy, but a relatively mild coercive strategy. You're not going to see many hundreds or many thousands of people dead, annually in such conflicts. The state will more likely use things like imprisonment, censorship, right? Things like, you're not going to have media access, you can't publish your newspapers and all of that stuff. Maybe curtailing the right to a free assembly, right? Like you can't rally or riot or whatever. But high levels of violence are not really going to be on the table here. And because the external threat is relatively muted, the state has a room for what I call tactical concessions, where it tries to split moderate separatists from radical separatists, right? Because it feels like it can play those types of negotiating games. However, when the outside actor steps up to moderate third-party support, this is where the state starts getting really serious, right? This is where the state is now essentially facing a civil war on its own soil, and it's fighting a civil war on its own soil. It's going to be targeting military camps, rebels, their supporters. It's not always going to practice ethical or legal counterinsurgency, right? So torture, enforced disappearances, all this stuff is totally consistent with a militarization policy. But there is still some level of discrimination employed in force and violence, right? The state is nasty, but maybe not as nasty as it could get, okay? That's that last node. That's collective repression. When the outside actor steps in with high levels of third-party support, essentially the state is not just fighting a civil war on its soil, it's fighting an interstate war on its soil, because literally the outside actor is now literally involved, okay? This is where the state just goes crazy, right? High levels of indiscriminate force, lots of human rights abuses. We start getting those really high death tolls, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands annually. And there's a couple of reasons for this. One is the material angle, as I said, right? The movement is relatively strong, and the state thinks it's in a fight for its life and has to go, all in. But this is where that emotional angle really kicks in, right? Like, how dare you? How dare you fight alongside our enemy, right? We will show you, right? And so that's where we get what I call collective repression. So just to sum up the basic theoretical framework, as I said, for a negotiation concession strategy, the state has to consider border changes acceptable, and the only way it considers border changes acceptable is if it knows or if it feels it's not going to be facing war in the future, right? On the other hand, if it does feel like it's going to face war in the future, that's where it says nobody's going anywhere, and how violent it is depends on how much third-party support is delivered to the separatists. Okay. So in the book, I look at a few different cases. The second half of the book looks at, first of all, the Armenian genocide. I look at the Israel-Palestinian dispute. I look at 2 peaceful separations of Norway, Sweden, and Czechoslovakia at the beginning and end of the 20th century, respectively. And I even look at the US Civil War very briefly. But the first half of the book, and the sort of summary I'm going to be giving you today, looks at South Asia. And South Asia is a great laboratory for students of secessionist conflict. It is a region most beset by separatism. Two of the top 3 countries in terms of most separatist movements are in South Asia. That's India and Burma, Myanmar, depending on what you believe. Right? There's a lot of internal variation, right? Sometimes states are really, really violent, and sometimes a little bit less violent, sometimes they're not that violent. So I just think it's an interesting place to look at separatist conflicts. And so what I do in the book is I look at relatively circumscribed periods in each of Pakistan and India and examine why these states treated different movements differently. So in the 1970s, I contrast Pakistan's treatment of East Pakistani separatists, or Bengali separatists that became Bangladesh, they were successful, versus Pakistan's treatment of Baloch separatists in the mid-1970s who were unsuccessful, and ask, why was East Pakistan so much more violent than Balochistan? Balochistan was violent, just not as violent. And then I look at India in the mid to late 1980s and maybe even early 1990s, where I compare 3 movements, Jammu and Kashmir, Punjab, and Assam in the northeast. Okay. So what type of data do I rely on for this book? I look at tens of thousands of pages of diplomatic archives, primarily US and British sources. I conducted 112 interviews with cops, soldiers, bureaucrats, politicians, journalists, analysts, scholars, like ... And I look at newspaper archives from 5 major South Asian newspapers. That's for this section of the book. Dawn, Times of India, Assam Tribune, Chandigarh Tribune, Kashmir Times. Okay. So I'm not going to get into any great depth right now in the talk. Maybe we can discuss more in the Q&A if you're interested exactly what I'm arguing. But I'm just going to give you the top line sort of results from both chapters. So in the Pakistan chapter, what I argue is that the reason Pakistan employed what I call collective repression in East Pakistan versus militarization in Balochistan was the external security angle. Right? So in East Pakistan, at the outset of the conflict, Pakistan had false perceptions of high Indian involvement. We can again get into the Q&A where those false perceptions come from. It's all about two-nation theory and racism, and we can get into all that. But essentially, the Pakistani state perceived that the Bengali movement was hand in glove with the Indian state. And reality very quickly caught up to Pakistan's false perceptions. Within about 4 or 5 weeks of conflict breaking out, like late April 71, early May 71, really late April 1971, India is all in, right, in terms of supporting the separatists. And so, for both material and emotional reasons, Pakistan is especially aggressive in East Pakistan, especially not just against the Hindu minority, which it was, but against all Bengali Muslims as well, primarily because of this perception of Indian involvement in the conflict. Whereas in Balochistan, we see a slightly different state. First of all, the 2 major possible patrons for the Baloch, the Soviet Union and India, both stayed out of this conflict in the mid-70s. There was some support from Afghanistan, especially after Dawood's coup. But that support was relatively limited. It was sanctuary, a little bit of military aid, but mostly just sanctuary. And more to the point, Afghanistan, relative to Pakistan, is a weaker state. It's not that big a deal in terms of geopolitics. And most importantly, in this crisis, Iran, which is a really major regional power, got involved in the conflict, not on the side of the separatists, but on the side of the state, which really helped mute the external security implications. So Iran had its own, and continues to have its own, Balochistan problem. And the Shah was very eager that the Baloch movement be stamped out, which the Shah has very interesting correspondences in the diplomatic archives between Shah and Bhutto. We can get into that. But be that as it may, the Shah is very, very eager for Baloch nationalists not to get any headway whatsoever. So Iran supplies Pakistan with jets, helicopters, pilots, money, which really helps in the conflict and ends up dissuading Pakistan from escalating to too high a level, right? It's the geopolitical implications of this conflict were just not that steep relative to what was going on in East Pakistan. Okay. So that, I argue, is what explains the distinction between East Pakistan and Balochistan in the 70s. India, very similar story. So in India, I conduct a couple of comparisons. One is across space, and one is across time. So across space, I'm comparing Kashmir, Jammu and Kashmir, to Assam in the northeast. And in Kashmir, right as Rubaiya Sayyid, the Home Minister's daughter, is kidnapped in, I want to say, December '89, the Indian state, is taking no prisoners at that time. It goes all in and appoints Jagmohan as governor, and security forces blanket the state, and there is a whole hell of a lot of repression that takes place over the next 3 or 4 years. Tens of thousands of people die. And the primary reason for this is both, as I said, the emotional and material aspects of perceived third-party support. It's specifically perceived Pakistani support for the Kashmiri separatists. There's a long-standing relationship and a long-standing perception that Pakistan is deeply involved in Kashmir. Pakistan had fought two wars prior to this crisis over Kashmir, or started 2 wars over Kashmir prior to this crisis. So the Indian state was very, very clear who exactly is responsible for what's going on here, right? Which meant that it could not sort of take things lightly, and it escalated. As soon as the conflict kicked off, it escalated to very high levels. Whereas in Assam, the exact same governments, right, we're talking about the VP Singh and the Chandrasekhar governments, exact same governments have a totally different take on how you deal with separatism in Assam. First of all, they totally ignore the problem for the best part of 2 or 3 years. But even when they finally start paying attention, they're not paying attention in terms of sending in tens of thousands of troops. They're promising financial aid. They're promising to build IITs, or Indian Institutes of Technology, right? They're just being very nice. And the reason I argue is that the 2 major players, Pakistan and China, were not involved in the Northeast in the 80s and 90s. Some journalists I spoke to said there were bases in Burma or Myanmar, which is fine. But again, the Burma-Myanmar case sort of mirrors the Afghanistan case from the Balochistan case study, where it's just not that big a deal to India if Burma or Myanmar is involved, right? Especially if it's just sanctuary support. So the Indian state could be relatively, conciliatory in Assam. Punjab, we see variation across time, okay? So between 1985 and 1987, Rajiv Gandhi comes to power, and at this time, the Indian state is thinking of the Punjab dispute primarily in domestic terms, and is happy to sign an accord, is happy to arrange elections in which the Akali Dal party, which is sort of Sikh nationalist / Punjabi nationalist, Akali Dal party wins. So you see a lot of conciliatory rhetoric from Rajiv Gandhi that the Sikhs are our brothers and all this stuff, right? 2 years later, as Pakistani support for the Punjabi militants or Sikh militants escalates to moderate levels, that's where the Indian state also escalates its response. It hands over control of the conflict to the Punjab police, led by KPS Gill, who recently died. And the Punjab police, again, is taking no prisoners. It's conducting full-blown counterinsurgency. We're now getting to those levels where you're getting 2,000-3,000 people dying every year, rather than a couple of hundred people, or maybe 25, 20, 30 people every year. And the primary reason for this is that the Punjabi separatists are now armed with equipment and training way better than the Indian state itself, right? When I was talking to Indian cops, they were just like, they were better armed than us, right? And the reason they were better armed is because Pakistan was arming them. And it's not a coincidence that this is happening right around the time of the drawdown in the Soviet Union, the Soviet drawdown in Afghanistan, where Pakistan has a lot of money and guns left over and is happy to sort of transfer them. Okay, so just to sum up the empirical story that I've given you, neither India nor Pakistan can go down that left-hand side of the graph because they live in a bad neighborhood, literally the worst neighborhood, actually. There is more aggression in South Asia than any other region in the world, including the Middle East, by the way. So the left-hand side of the graph is totally out of the question for both India and Pakistan, right? But the question is, where on the right-hand side of the graph do they fall? And when third-party support is really high, that's where you get the state going completely crazy, as it did in East Pakistan and Kashmir, respectively. When there's really no external security angle, or there is a very limited external security angle, that's where the state is relatively conciliatory, signing accords and whatnot. That's in Punjab. And then Balochistan and Punjab, in the second iteration of Punjab, that's where the state is sort of at this moderate level, where it's fighting a counterinsurgency. It's a ghastly civil war, yes, but maybe not as bad as it could get. Okay, so let me just quickly conclude. First of all, I hope to have convinced you, or at least made you think about, the fact that external security affects state strategy against separatists. And the reason this should make sense is because secession, by definition, is one of those things that exists at the interface of domestic and international. You're really making domestic claims, but the outcome is international. You're changing a border. You're making a new country, right? So it would make sense for the international environment to matter in any considerations of state strategy against separatists. A couple of implications that come out of my work. Theoretically, as I said, the external environment matters, and I think scholars should care about it in this literature. Again, we can get in the Q&A, but this literature is dominated by people who only look at domestic factors. That's why that thing is up there. To the international community, people who are interested and have the power, people who are interested in maybe curtailing separatist conflicts, what I would say is you want to put the security incentives and motivations of the state front and center, right? Maybe give security guarantees to the state in return for, good conduct, right? Like, we'll give you a lot of military aid as long as you don't, and we'll give you a security guarantee and we'll be your best friend, as long as you treat your separatists well, right? You got to make that bargain. And restrain rivals, right? If you have the power to restrain the state's rivals and say, don't take advantage of what's going on right now. Just keep your mouth shut. Don't say anything. Don't do anything. All you're going to do is cause trouble for the people that you are conceivably trying to help. And speaking of the people you're trying to help, to the rebels, I would say be careful, right? I can totally see why, when you're up against this big behemoth called the modern bureaucratic state, that you need all the help that you can get, and you'll reach anywhere for that help, and if it comes from outside, so be it, right? I get it. All I'm saying is sometimes that help can result in more pain and result in more costs than benefits, right? Especially for the wider public. Maybe not for the leaders of the movement, and this is where we start getting like principal agent problems and get into all that. But at least for the wider public, that sort of association with the external rival can spell a lot of trouble. Anyways, I should not have done that. There we go. Thanks for listening, guys, and I look forward to your Q&A and to the discussion comments.
Great, thank you. Okay, so maybe the panelists can join us here, and we'll have a discussion about this. We'll put Ahsan on the end there. Yeah. Okay, so I've invited a couple of discussants to talk about the book that they've now consumed, both by reading it, but also in terms of the presentation. And they come from different backgrounds, but I think that's sort of the purpose of this discussion, is to have a variety of perspectives in assessing the validity and then also the utility of the theory, both for research, but also for practitioners as well. So next to Ahsan is Tamanna Salikuddin, who's a former senior advisor to the Special Representative for Afghanistan and Pakistan at the U.S. State Department. She was there from 2014 to 2017, and previously a former director for Afghanistan and Pakistan at the National Security Council from 2011 to 2013. So probably a tremendous amount of experience dealing with these actual issues as they exist in the present form today. She has expertise in a range of topics related to South Asia, including counterterrorism, governance issues, and domestic reform in Pakistan, Afghanistan, and India. And to her left, my right, Alec Worsnop is an assistant professor in the School of Public Policy at the University of Maryland, College Park, and also a non-resident fellow at the Modern War Institute at West Point. He studies issues related to civil war, military effectiveness, civil-military relations, and institutional development in conflict or post-conflict environments. So maybe I'll ask Tamanna to start things off and reflect for maybe about 8 to 10 minutes on the book, and then Alec to follow, and then we'll have a little discussion afterwards and open up to Q&A.
Thank you so much. Thank you to Stimpson and to Samir for putting together such a great discussion and allowing us to step back and sort of structurally look at some of the causes of insurgencies and anti-state secessionists. Often we're mired, at least practitioners and policymakers are often so mired in the conflict, sometimes it's hard to step back and really look at these structural causes. And so I want to, sorry, should turn that on. Congratulations to Ahsan for an excellent introductory work. I really enjoyed actually reading the book. And it was interesting, as somebody who spent my career focused on South Asia, it was very interesting to actually look at the South Asian examples and compare them to the other examples you use in Europe and elsewhere, and even the US Civil War. I thought that was very interesting. And I found in terms of South Asia specifically, I found your argument quite, it resonates quite well in terms of security rivalries and how deeply they impact a state strategy and the actual response to insurgents or secessionists. Beyond academic theory, I think it's a great academic theory. I think your book is actually quite useful to policymakers both in the US but also in South Asia as they're dealing with some of these insurgencies. And I also found it quite useful for practitioners in peace building. So as somebody who is very involved in peace processes, both in Sri Lanka and then in Afghanistan, the appreciation of the international factors in such conflicts is something that I think people seeking a peaceful negotiation to a conflict really do have to take into account. And is often something that is sort of swept to the side. Let's just deal with the insurgents in the state and ignore all the other parties who are sort of the elephants in the room. In my work, I found very similar trends when you look in Sri Lanka, for example, with the LTTE. Definitely the otherizing of the Tamil Tigers, making them seem more Indian than Sri Lankan because they were Hindu and Tamil speaking versus Sinhalese and Buddhist. I mean, and the betrayal, definitely the sense of betrayal which was done not only by the state, but something that was propagated among the population in Sri Lanka, that these LTTE and Jaffna, they're betraying our state. So it resonated quite well. And even in my recent work on Afghanistan, while people may not think of the Afghanistan conflict as a traditional secessionist or anti-state movement, I think the Afghan Taliban's anti-state, or what you could see as a domestic insurgency, maybe representing rural southern Pashtuns against an urban elite or Tajiks and a non-Pashtun movement, would have remained domestic if it were not for the outsized support for all sides by regional actors and not just Pakistan. We hear often in Kabul that this isn't a domestic conflict, that this is an international conflict, and I think that very clearly is argued in your book. But beyond that, I think you see in the Afghan conflict the influence of world powers, the United States, of China, Russia, cause a conflict that might have a domestic political solution to grow to the size where it's almost impossible to get a negotiated solution, as you argue in some of your graphs. I think another thing that I found really impactful in your book, and specifically on South Asia, is many of the conflicts that you talk about, and almost all the secessionist conflicts, stem from partition and stem from a post-colonial identity building. I think that's often ignored, and you allude to it in your book. In the Punjab section, you do talk about how none of these conflicts are monocausal, right? There are many, many reasons, and I think in South Asia, both Pakistan's active identity building and India's active identity building, because they need to have a reason to exist, to be a state with these set borders, really does manifest itself in many of the secessionist movements, and you allude to it in your book. For example, in East Pakistan, which becomes Bangladesh, it's very easy for West Pakistan to otherize Bengali Muslims even.
Right.
Of course, they attack the Hindus as a minority and see them as traitors, with India. But even Bengali Muslims, they take their language, their culture, their dress, their heritage, which pre-independence, pre-partition was a fluid identity, and they reify what it means to be a Pakistani, that you must speak Urdu, that you must dress a certain way, that you must eat a certain way. Where in reality, that fluid nature of their culture, a Bengali Muslim had as much in common with an Indian Tamil as they did with a Pakistani Baloch, right?
Right.
But they ignore that reality and betray them, say that you are now in bed with India. And it makes it so much easier to use that repressive amount of violence when you do not see them as your own countrymen. And similarly in Kashmir, seeing Jammu and Kashmir as the only Muslim majority state in India, it's very easy to otherize the Kashmiris in their dress, in their food, in their language, calling them Pakistani, that they cheer for Shahid Afridi in cricket, so they must be with Pakistan.
Even Pakistanis don't do that.
Even Pakistanis don't do that, right? But funny enough, Kashmiri culture, you couldn't argue that it is Pakistani, or you could argue that it's Pakistani or Indian or neither. There are not in Azad Jammu and Kashmir or Gilgit-Baltistan, you don't find people speaking Kashmiri. And Kashmiri itself as a language has as many cognates with Sanskrit as it does with Farsi. So, it is this idea of identity that allows these states to otherize and treat their own populations in this repressive way. So I think that's really important. Lastly, I do want to touch on, the fact that many of these conflicts continue. Bangladesh resolved, thankfully, but other conflicts, Jammu and Kashmir, especially recently, with the execution of Afzal Guru in 2013 and the targeted killing of Lalwani in 2016, you have a resurgence. After a bit of a peaceful lull, you have a huge resurgence in Kashmir of anti-state or secessionist activity. Similarly, I would say in Balochistan, you have ups and downs. When I was in Quetta, the funny thing is you go there and the Balochis will still talk about a Punjabi colonial presence. And it often looks, to me, having gone to Srinagar and Quetta, there are a lot of similarities in how both of these states deal with these countries. And the Baloch are very vocal in saying that we would accept help from anyone, India, Afghanistan. But I think what's interesting in your argument is that sometimes it's the perception by the state that leads to the actual help. And that I would argue is very useful for policymakers, both Indian and Pakistani policymakers. The more you believe, the more you put out the perception, the more the separatists reach. So I don't know which starts the other, but I think, at least in the Balochistan case, it's very much the perception leads to more and more actual external help, which exacerbates the problem. Lastly, I would just say I think the book is great for those who are looking for negotiated settlements to really look at how otherizing secessionists and look at the impact of not only regional competitors, as you talk about, but also large states, as US and China get involved in some of what would be domestic conflicts. How does it make it much harder to get to a negotiated peace settlement? How does it cut off pathways that might have been open if it was domestic? And I think your book does a great job, and I'd welcome your thoughts more on that as well. Thank you.
Great. Thanks a lot to Stimpson and Samir as well for hosting this and having me. So I really enjoyed getting the opportunity to read this book, Ahsan. It's, I think, an important example of setting clear observable implications to develop and test an argument that has both clear academic and policy kind of implications or importance, applicability. So I guess I'll go through some kind of the unique contributions I think you've made, and then talk a little bit about the avenues for future research that I think you've opened up that we can use to add on to this book. So first of all, I think that most of we've had like all this research into how the international dimensions of civil war matter. Most of this has tended to focus on kind of the role of the external actor, either in how they change the conflict or what they enable rebels to do, right? But I think a kind of key contribution of this book is kind of recognizing that international actors shape the preferences and behavior of the counterinsurgent or the actual state actor, which is really an important step forward. So the state is carefully assessing the behavior and preferences of what external actors might do and crafting policy that actually often responds to potential involvement rather than involvement itself. And I think that's actually one of the most powerful kind of steps forward you take, is recognizing that the state can't wait for an external actor to intervene. They have to act before that, especially given kind of the geopolitical consequences of not acting. So in that context, right, much of the brutal violence we see in sub-state conflict or in civil wars happens at the prospect of international involvement, not before. This was true in Rwanda, Syria, and Libya. So understanding why states will react this way sometimes but not others is kind of an important step forward and something I think policymakers kind of definitely need to keep in mind. Second, and I think along these lines, focusing on the state again, bringing the state back into conflict the state's involved in. I think it's important that you kind of disaggregate the different strategy, how the state might use different strategies against the same groups over time. We tend to really assume that state strategies will treat the same ethnic groups in the same ways despite changes in conflict conditions, and kind of they're reacting to these hardened identity differences rather than the actual conflict dynamics. But I think the book helps us to recognize that longstanding disagreements and animosities actually don't necessarily engender intense violence, and it's demonstrated in the variation you identify in the Indian treatment of the Sikh nationalists, as well as the behavior of young Turks towards Armenians. We observe similar cycles of violence in countries I study, Iran, Lebanon, Algeria. So by kind of breaking out state behavior, I think you contribute to further defining the sub-state or the state insurgent bargaining relationship, and kind of understanding that states don't follow hearts and minds strategies or brute force strategies. They do something in between, and they do different things at different times. The same way we acknowledge that insurgent forces use quite different strategies. And then kind of the third kind of useful contribution for me is providing straightforward theory that's accessible to policymakers and contributes to strategic thinking. So I'm currently teaching a military intervention class right now to Masters of Public Policy students. And in this class, we're constantly frustrated, right, about how social scientific frameworks are unclear about the sequencing and applicability of ethnic differences in starting and kind of sustaining conflict. So questions like, when and why are ethnic groups excluded? Why do states take actions that might foment further international involvement to limit the influence or reach of much smaller or much weaker ethnic groups? Is it possible for international actors to intervene in an impartial manner? These are all ongoing questions that we've had for the last 20 years studying these types of conflict, and I think you provide some kind of useful places to grab onto in that context. So I'll be assigning your book next semester for sure.
Sales right there.
Exactly. I should have had my class come to buy them. So beyond these contributions, I kind of believe the manuscript provides some excellent paths forward that, will perhaps undoing a bit of your parsimony, I apologize for that, may help us to understand the factors that shape patterns of violence internally. And I should commend you for that parsimony, actually, in a topic like this. So first, as a researcher of the kind of internal dynamics of insurgent groups, you might see where I'm going. But I see a range of mechanisms that underscore why states might perceive separatist movements or groups as threats to the viability of the state that are separate of the role of external kind of involvement. So while you focus on external support, we see many conflicts where groups generate extensive capabilities without access to strong external patrons. So it's true of the Viet Minh in Vietnam before the Chinese intervention, of the Islamic State and Al-Qaeda in Iraq now, or of the US Confederacy, kind of as you point out. And on the other hand, history is littered of cases of insurgents receiving external support and being probably worse for the wear for having received that, right? So it's true of many of the nationalist challengers in Lebanon, or in Vietnam, ML in Lebanon, or Renamo in Mozambique. And you identify a similar pattern with Sikh nationalists actually kind of being fragmented. So in short, I think capacity is likely more complicated, and states are probably not only looking at international support, but a host of other key variables. So I'll talk briefly, perhaps, about some of those. So I think future research needs to understand in this context what makes secessionist movements viable, right? This should be central to the states. Not necessarily external support, but really what makes the secessionist movement a viable threat. Could it become its own state? So I guess just the most simple answer is that I believe states should be fearful of more militarily cohesive rebel groups. Their capacity to generate force should be scary, separate of their external involvement, or perhaps despite of it. But I think this opens other kind of interesting avenues. So perhaps on the other hand, lower capacity would be more daunting to states that are fearing these secessionist threats. So for example, as part of my research, I look at when insurgent groups are able to keep ceasefires in civil war. And this kind of capability, this organizational power to make sure your fighters don't fight, actually seems like really important to states that are fearing the secessionist kind of break-off, because they'd like to know if the leaders of those nascent states will actually be able to control their fighters, control their army. And perhaps having less internal control will make the commitment problem that you identify, so how rebels would behave after independence, a lot stronger if states fear, right, that they won't be able to do that. But then beyond the violent components of insurgent capacity, I really think that states should be more likely to be very fearful of separatist groups that have started to state up, so to provide state services, governance, justice, this sort of thing. So there's no doubt that part of Israel's discomfort with Hamas, or the reason that South Vietnam worked with the US in the Strategic Hamlet program, is they really weren't that happy about the provision of governance that those groups were providing in those places. They were substituting the government. So a separatist movement that has demonstrated the ability to govern, to provide services, justice, in other words, shown a real pathway to statehood, should be pretty scary to these groups. And that could be separate of military capacity. So Jaish al-Mahdi in Iraq is kind of a middling military power, but its social services provision is quite sprawling, and that proposed arguably a much bigger, or posed a much bigger threat to the state than its military might. So in terms of that model, it would be useful to consider why states let governance capacities develop in the first place. They should see that as just as dangerous as the military threat that's going on. So why did they let the slack develop in these secessionist areas, whether through lack of inclusion, inequitable distribution of wealth, and so on and so forth? These should be just as dangerous to the states, and the threat they see shouldn't be interpreted by, or shouldn't be kind of seen as violence alone. So this would be an important step forward. And then I'll skip, I just want to make one last point, actually. So beyond kind of thinking about secessionist viability, I'd like to pose maybe a broader question that your work really underscores, in that given the secular decline of interstate war, along with our growing kind of understanding of just how costly sub-state conflict has been, especially in the last century, I think there's a lot of room to better understand why states respond so strongly to secessionist threats. I think you're right that they see the potential secessionist movement as posing an external security threat if they break off, but the question is, why do they see that as more dangerous than the secessionist movement itself? So do weak secessionist states actually pose a greater threat to state power and efficacy down the road? And do external actors actually have greater leverage by manipulating insurgents or rebels within a state than they actually would have if that state was independent down the road? You actually might be much better off manipulating somebody inside the borders rather than an external power, and might be able to weaken your rivals more that way. And so why are states hanging on to these really violent conflicts, if perhaps in the interstate world where now we don't expect there to be so much regional conflict? And so in that context, I wonder if your identification of outrage and emotional response might actually play a much larger role, kind of in a nationalist sense of why states are fighting these costly conflicts, if there isn't actually evidence that they might pose a real threat, when they're detached from the country. I'll stop there.
Okay, that was quite a comprehensive set of comments. Hopefully that was valuable for Ahsan, maybe in sort of a second book project down the road. You can say it was spawned here. But Ahsan, do you maybe want to offer a couple responses briefly, and then we can open up to Q&A?
Sure.
Or you can save it. It's up to you.
Yeah, I thought open up Q&A.
Okay.
I don't want to pick just one or two.
Sure.
There's a lot of really good comments that I feel like I don't want to pick just one.
Yeah, fair.
So I think it's just better to open up the Q&A.
Okay, that was very deftly handled. I want to throw a quick question, not only to you, but to the entire panel. Actually, it's two questions, so I'll sneak them in there because you passed on your time. but I do think there's sort of ideas that were triggered in the presentation and your comments. So the first is there today such a thing as a sanguine state anymore? Is it possible for states to really concede anything, at least up front, because of uncertainty in the future and maybe competitive pressures? it seems to me that states that you would think would be sort of more sanguine because of sort of natural defenses, like island countries like Indonesia or the Philippines, also engage in pretty intense violence against secessionism. So I'm just wondering, and maybe this is something that, for a unique period in the 1990s, you could have something like a velvet divorce, but maybe today, again, because of sort of competitive pressures, it's less likely. So maybe the rest of the panel can also comment on that. And the second, and again for the panel, is it seems as in the crucial variable here is perception of external support. I think this is something that Tamanna highlighted. But how often do you, in your empirical analysis and in our observations generally, do states get those perceptions right? How often are the perceptions actually matched up with sort of actual material conditions? Because it seems that there's both incentives to misrepresent it from the rebel side, but also incentives to inflate from the state side. And so what you get is, a hyperventilation of sort of every single event. I mean, and having looked at, particularly in the case of South Asia, every instance of, a rebel group, or not even rebel group, sort of a nationalist movement, is seen immediately as sort of a, demanding full-on secession and separatism. So maybe you guys could offer some thoughts. Maybe we'll start with you and go down the line.
So there I don't have to pick, so I can actually answer the questions.
Awesome.
Is there such a thing as a sanguine state anymore? I think so. I think that, so in the book, I'm clear that most states are insecure, right? Like most states at most times will be insecure. The post-security environments are very rare. So you're right to note that this is like a rare outcome, but I don't think it's a non-existent outcome, right? So like if the Quebecois stand up tomorrow, Canada is not going to mow them down with like AK-47s or whatever, right? They'll be like, sure, you want your country, you can take it, no problem, right? So I think, and a lot of these Pacific islands, like a lot in the secessionist data set, like a lot of them are, from South Asia and Africa and so on, but like a lot of them are in these Pacific island communities, and there we don't see obviously like these, these crazy escalations. So I do think that there's sanguine states, they're just rare, but you're totally right to know that there's a variation across time component here, like the collapse of the Soviet Union post-Cold War. I mean, that's where the Czechoslovakian case comes in, where this big sort of structural shift in international politics, geopolitics is really driving their perceptions of how secure they are. And you're right to note that 2018 just seems, just from reading the front page of the Times or the Post, it just seems like a different time than 1992, right? So I grant that. How often are perceptions right? So this is a very interesting question. When I first started this way back, when I started the dissertation, I thought that this would be my biggest problem, precisely because of what you're saying, which is states lie all the time, and states are always saying these guys are in bed with our enemies, right? Which I think is a really difficult problem if you're trying to sort of tease out what's actually going on in the present. I think it's a slightly more manageable problem if you're looking at the past. In particular, a lot of these archives, as well as media reports from quote-unquote unbiased sources, can really help disentangle those situations from where the state is lying to those from where it actually perceives third-party support. And the reason I say this is because states are really bad liars. They're really clumsy liars. So to give you two examples in the book, there are false perceptions where I code them as false perceptions. Where I code them as deliberately misleading perceptions, not false perceptions, right? So one is Pakistan and Balochistan with the Iraqi arms incident. So some of you may already know this, but like Bhutto in the mid-70s literally conjures up an incident from thin air where like he's saying these arms are destined from Iraq and they end up in the Islamabad embassy and they're going to Balochistan. It's just I'm not going to say what it is, but it's a mess, okay? And it's clearly a lie, right? And all the US diplomats and all the British diplomats are saying the same thing. And so I can use that and say it's a lie, right? Similarly, by the same token, in the mid-80s, before she was killed, Indira Gandhi was saying, these Sikh nationalists, they're hand in glove with Pakistan, even though Pakistan was very wary in 84, 85 of stepping in. It's really 86, 87 where they actually step in. And, they're saying things like, at the Golden Temple, there were people who were like, who had circumcisions or whatever, and oh, so that means that, it's just like, and there you get the foreign media saying, Indira Gandhi is full of it and she's lying. So my point is that those are really easy situations to point and say that's not much easier than I first thought when I started the project. So it's less of a concern when you actually do it.
Samir, I would want to comment on the perceptions of external support. I think it's interesting that usually one follows the other, right? So usually the external support often catches up with at least part of the perceptions, which is an interesting thing. So I think that's a good piece of evidence for states to think about, because what they think they're doing by using this propaganda, hyperventilation, whatever you want to call it, is drawing in support for their side. But often, by accusing their rival of external support, they actually invite them to increase the external support. Secondly, what they do is they internationalize what might have been a domestic dispute. And I don't mean just by their neighboring rival, but you bring in other states. I mean, Bangladesh is a great example of where the accusations of Indian support, then, they're reaching out to the US, they're reaching out to the USSR at the time. I mean, they're bringing in bigger, powerful regional states and internationalize and exacerbate what might have been a smaller conflict. So the hyperventilation often hurts both the state and the rebels, actually. So.
This is one thing I would, before Alec, this is one thing where you're totally right. Like, so like the one comment where you made about, this being like a self-fulfilling prophecy, I think was like your last comment. In the Baloch case, it is absolutely what happens in the East Pakistan / Bangladesh case, where like, due to like, again, we can get into it, but due to all like these false perceptions of racism, essentialism, Bengali identity, Pakistani identity, Indian identity, Pakistan believes, Bengalis are hand in glove with the Indian state, which only makes them actually go hand in glove with the Indian state, like literally 4 weeks into the war. So you're totally right on that.
Yeah, I think just to add on to that too, that at least in insurgent groups I study, they sometimes go to great lengths to hide their interactions with international actors. So to the extent to which the state accuses them of it, it kind of lets them get rid of that kind of cover-all and go all in, either asking for support from somebody else or just being much more blatant about it. So it's the same sort of, I think, self-fulfilling prophecy.
Okay, so let's open up to Q&A. We've got a few questions here. So let's sit with one of our visiting fellows here, Yaqub.
So, okay. Hi, Ahsan. It's Yaqub from Kashmir. Now, I was just very small.
Yaqub, sorry, I should have said this. Can you introduce your affiliation as well?
Okay. I'm Yaqub from Kashmir. Actually, I'm here a South Asian Vice visiting fellow. I work in a New Delhi-based think tank. So my question is, how apt is it to compare Kashmir with Balochistan, wherein Kashmir is a UN-recognized dispute, and India has acknowledged at times, right from its inception, as Pakistan as a party to dispute. So if you go to this, so there had been the talks between Nehru, Liaquat talks, Nehru, Uyub talks, and since going on. Don't you think that recognition, that sort of makes it altogether different than Balochistan and the other issues?
No, I guess the reason I compare, situations like Kashmir and Balochistan is because, so I guess I see what you're saying, where Kashmir, is more of an interstate dispute than Balochistan is. So we want to separate so Kashmir is really complicated for a couple of reasons, and the main reason it's complicated in my view is that it's an interstate conflict and a separatist conflict sort of wrapped up in one. And I think what you're getting at is the interstate angle, so like, with the Ayub talks and the Nehru talks and all this stuff, and like, that's totally fair. It is an interstate dispute, and that's partly why it becomes so violent in my view. But that doesn't mean it's not a separatist dispute, right? And so the Baloch dispute might not be an interstate dispute yet, I guess, but it is most certainly a separatist dispute, as is the Kashmir conflict in my view. And, my sort of fail-safe on this is like, very well-cited data sets on secessionism, like Bridget Coggins' book, have both the Baloch and the Kashmiris over decades. So I feel comfortable saying they're comparable in the sense that they're both separatists. You're totally right to note that Kashmir has this added angle of the interstate dispute, and that makes it really difficult. But I'm going to stick with the comparison.
Any other thoughts on that? Okay. All right. This gentleman here. We'll just keep on rotating around. Oh, hold on. Switch the mic. Just introduce yourself and your affiliate.
Hi, thank you so much for the panel. I'm Akbar Ahmed, I'm with the Huffington Post. I had a couple of just interrelated questions on the Balochistan example in particular. Can you comment on do you feel Pakistan has ever been sanguine, like not insecure enough to ever make any concessions to the Baloch?
No chance.
So no?
No chance.
And secondly, identifying the leadership and the authenticity of the sentiment there, right? Because particularly in the 70s, there was certain tribal chieftains who were leading insurgency. How do we measure how widespread support for insurgency has ever been in Balochistan and how it is now? And secondly, or thirdly, I guess, why does it matter? Pakistan is talking a lot about Balochistan being the center of the China-Pakistan economic corridor, all this money is coming in. Does Baloch separatism matter anymore, or is it just going to be swept to the side?
Okay.
how do I identify whether it's authentic or not? So this is a really good question. So different cases will have different, so my analysis kicks off with what I call secessionist moments, right? Where the movement is making what I consider to be a fairly clear demand for autonomy or independence. You're totally right. I think the subtext of your point is totally on point, which is, in different situations, whether you're a democracy or authoritarian state, whether you're a big state or small state, whether you're a rich state or poor state, that secessionist moment is going to look different, right? So in a democracy, it might be an election, right? Where you say, 52% of this party or whatever, blah, 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 right? But in an autocracy, you might get a different situation. And in a lot of these cases, you're sort of in these hybrid regimes, right? So India is a democracy, yes, but in Kashmir, is it really a democracy, right? Maybe like the classic line where Indian democracy ends at Kashmir, right? So, there you need, in my view, the kidnapping of the Home Minister's daughter is that secessionist moment, right? So that's really where the analysis kicks off, and it's not necessarily a judgment on how widespread the feeling is. You're totally right to note that in different contexts, you'll have sometimes very low support. That doesn't mean the state can say, well, I guess it's not a big deal, right? So in sometimes you'll have 20, 30% support. Like the Slovakians, for instance, they were, in that case, you literally had poll numbers. In Balochistan, you're not going to get a poll, right? But in Slovakia, you had poll numbers saying like 30% of them wanted independence, right? And they got it. So, I guess what I would say is, from the state's perspective, they can't be thinking, well, it's 32%, so we're safe, but when it gets to 48%, we got to worry. Like, they can't make those judgments. If you're a realist, you can't worry about that. Does Baloch separatism still matter? I think it definitely still matters. I think the reasons that you cited are reasons for it to matter more, not less, right? CPEC makes Baloch separatism more prominent and more of an issue, which is why Pakistan is super worried about it. It's assigned entire not divisions but almost brigades to Chinese engineers and whatnot. It's a totally different point to note where the Baloch movement is right now. I think it's probably at its weakest than it has been in the last decade, and that sort of coincides with the CPEC issue. But 3 years down the line, it could be totally different, right? It would be totally different. I have no idea. But I think it matters a lot.
This is just my personal observations of the Baloch conflict. I think it's important to note that Ahsan's book does a great job in comparing sort of structural secessionism, but doesn't necessarily qualitatively give an equivalence to all of the different secessionist movements. So I think it's hard to say the Baloch movement is on a quantitative scale X and Kashmir is Y. I think it's very hard to compare those things. I think what is more important is how, in a state's calculus, how important is it? Interestingly, when you go through Bhutto's,
lies.
Yes, those, but also his journals about, they don't mention, Balochistan was literally at the height of the conflict, and the center didn't really pay much attention to it, right? So I think there's two different measurements. How real is the conflict in the place, and how much is the center actually paying attention or reacting to it? How much is it a domestic political issue for them, and how much is it an international issue for them? So since 2006, I've been to Balochistan several times. Balochistan has some interesting things, which Ahsan notes, in the sense that it's a province where the north is really Pashtun speaking, is not Baloch, and Balochistan is such a big province with a population that's so spread out, which doesn't allow for the same type of cohesion that you might find in some of the other conflicts. That being said, I think it's a sine curve. During the time of Musharraf, you see highs and lows in terms of the conflict, and you see points where the Baloch nationalists or separatists are more unified, and then where they're less unified. You have many of the leadership now living outside of Balochistan, whether in other countries or in Karachi or wherever. So I think it's hard to really measure the conflict. What is interesting, I think, recently, even though they might be at the low ebb of the conflict, in response to maybe India's challenges on Pakistan about Pakistan interfering in Kashmir or in other places in India, the Pakistani government continually raises what they perceive as Afghanistan and India interfering in Balochistan. So whether or not the Baloch conflict is actually sustainable or at a high level, it is still used by the center as a means to internationalize the conflict. So consistently you hear Islamabad talk about Indian and Afghan interference in Balochistan.
Alec, maybe I can get you to sort of jump in as well. I mean, I think implicit in the question was two things. One, how consequential is it, depending on how widespread the base of support is for a rebel or sort of nationalist group? And second, how consequential are the stakes of the actual, maybe like material stakes of the territory? Do those factor into either state strategy or to the intensity of a conflict in some way?
Yeah, no, so I think this is an important step forward for the argument that I think the international involvement proxies picks up a lot of state involvement, but I mean, it seems like variation must be explained to some extent, right, by how big of a threat the insurgent group actually poses, right, that it's just not going to be worth it to invest a lot of resources in a place where you don't have a particularly dangerous group. And similarly, like if you're less worried about the actual probability of secession at a given moment, I can understand diverting resources sort of elsewhere. But this is interesting, right, this discussion that once the conflict's been internationalized, it introduces a whole different set of factors that both sides potentially have incentives to keep it at the forefront. And this might make the group, A, seem more powerful than it is, or B, let the state use it for something else. So it seems like both have incentives to keep it around. But yeah, I think this is an important point, that some of the fluctuation must be due to the capacity of the groups, of the secessionist groups themselves.
I'll just add, though, that, in the question of how widespread, I mean, there is a strategy that groups can utilize to induce sort of greater buy-in, which is a provocation strategy. This is something that Kid and Walter talk about a little bit. And in doing so, they can induce the state to overreact, and then build up the base of support for that group. And I think a great example is the KLA in Kosovo. Okay, go here, and then we'll move on to this gentleman here in the front.
My name is Sufi Lagari. I'm with the Sindhi Foundation, and I'm from the Sindh province. And probably Pakistan also is the result of the separatism and secessionist during the British time, get the separate movement from the divided India. And I think you discuss about Balochistan, but Sindh province, Mr. G.M. Syed, who wrote 55 books, and after the Bangladesh war, he actually demanded for the Sindhu Desh. And he was the first actually passed the resolution for Pakistan. I don't know, have you discussed about Sindh in your book or not, but it is also very important, because when Benazir Bhutto murdered, the President Zardari said that Pakistan Khape means we want Pakistan, because there was a very strong resentment in the Sindh province. They want to independence or separate, even MRD movement time too. And if the Sindh and Balochistan, because after Balochistan, the more Baloch lived, any other province lived in Sindh, it is very difficult to be handled. And I don't know, when you call the secessionist or separatist, and then some people call it independent and freedom, or the liberation movement, where you stand on these things. Thank you.
Okay, maybe I'll add to that, because this is a question that someone has raised as well, which is secessionists versus separatists, but also autonomy movements. How do you distinguish those types of groups?
So let me take that question first. So in the literature, and this is not just me, this is people who sort of work on this, secession movements demanding autonomy and movements demanding secession are treated one and the same, not just by scholars, but by the states. Or at least that's what scholars are asserting, right? And the reason is very simple, is because one can mean the other, right? So for instance, when you're demanding autonomy, that could just be, the Trojan horse that you are riding in on that will eventually deliver secession. So it's sort of, you're lying, right? Strategic bluffing, I guess. But you can work the other way. You can be demanding secession and really deep down be totally happy with autonomy, and it's just your first bid in a bargaining. So from the perspective of the state and the perspective of the scholars studying the state and the movement, there isn't that much value added to distinguishing between movements for autonomy or independence. So that's what I would say about that. On the Sindhi case, so there's certainly, as you told G.M. Syed, and you're totally right, that Sindhi nationalism has been sort of, a recurring theme in Pakistan's political history for the best part of, 6-7 decades. I guess as it is with Sindh and Pakistan, with 200 countries around the world, there's a lot of national groups, a lot of ethnic groups that make all sorts of demands, and they have to cross a certain threshold of power or cohesion or organizational strength or in terms of the movement for it to qualify in the universe of cases, right? For it to sort of be studied. And so you're totally right that Sindhi nationalism has been sort of a recurring theme. It may not arise necessarily, in my view, maybe you disagree, it may not rise to the level of Baloch nationalism or Bengali nationalism in 71 or Kashmiri nationalism nowadays. So it's not to say that Sindhi nationalism doesn't exist or it's not a strong theme. It's just maybe it's not as strong as some of the other claims made, and so that's why it's not really in the book.
Okay. Does anyone else have any?
I just had
Yeah,
a quick
please.
comment,
Yeah.
actually. Interestingly, I spent time in Pakistan talking to Sindhi nationalists, and interestingly, they cited examples in India of states breaking apart, and not, to give them more autonomy, to give them nationalism, of breaking apart from maybe from Karachi, which maybe was Muhajir dominated, and making a more Sindhi focused province, but they cited examples where the Bombay presidency was made into Maharashtra and Gujarat, linguistic ethnic groups, and even now Telangana breaking away from Andhra Pradesh. So I mean, it's interesting, and I'd love to hear Ahsan at some point talk about this. But this incrementalism, where what are other ways that states deal with this sort of ethno-nationalist demands?
Yeah,
really
please.
quickly. One theme in the book that I think you could have even pushed more is that I think there's an argument to be made that autonomy is perhaps even more dangerous to a state in the short term. It's an ungoverned space that's within your borders of somebody that A, could change their mind to decide they want to take your state over internally, and but B, you're responsible for it still, even though it's a kind of totally ungoverned space. So
that's a good
I
point.
can see the states see them as
And that does go back to one of your points where you were talking about, if I can find your comment real quick. You said the state should fear groups that have the ability to govern.
Yeah.
That's very much along that. They only get that ability to govern when the state says, sure, teach your language, raise your own taxes and whatever. When you do that, all you're doing is, that's a proto-state.
Yeah. I don't know if it's coincidental, but after the ceasefire agreement in Sri Lanka, when the rebel groups start to actually govern, then the hammer comes down after them. There's probably other reasons to precipitate it, but that's probably.
And in Sri Lanka, people supported where the LGTB was able to deliver better protections for women in terms of domestic violence, and all of these things were used to build support. It was actually service delivery that created a huge response in Colombo.
But it is a puzzle because the state was financing a lot of that activity, so that's a dissertation topic probably in and of itself. Okay, so we've got a bunch of hands up here. Why don't we try to bundle a few now because we're coming down to the wire. So when we start with the gentleman back there, and maybe we'll collect three and then take the speakers.
Steve Winters, independent consultant. Just a pretty brief question, but it ties into the discussion just had in terms of whether you have an independence movement or a secessionist movement, so forth and so on, or insurgent movement. The question is, because of the international precedent set by Kosovo and the court ruling, international court ruling, it was 2007 or 8, that yes, it is, according to international law, legal for a group within a state to demand autonomy and, if necessary, fight for it, even though that might break the laws of the state involved. And of course, President Putin in Russia has cited this ruling on Kosovo to try to justify the referendum in Crimea and the Crimea joining. So could you just quickly comment on that legal implications?
It's a great question. Let's add a couple more real quick. So right next to you, Hamza, and then to Emily.
Yeah, I like your work presentation. I do a lot of work on this. I'm from AU, but I think the key question really is, why do groups want to separate? Even the word separatism is very much a loaded word. Just as your whole presentation privileges a state, the maps of the region change all the time. If you look at the map of Europe over 150 years, it has changed tremendously. And so will Asia. And you are privileging force and power in your presentation. There's no approach to look at it in terms of the sovereignty of the people. If you privilege sovereignty, ideas of nation and state, you rethink them, then you can move in a more peaceful direction than what you suggest. I think it's a fundamental flaw in your argument.
Okay, so we'll flip that as a question of why privileged sovereignty, and then let's come to Emily.
Hi, I'm Emily. I work for the Stimpson Center.
No, I understand.
I got it. Yeah, I have an answer for you. Go ahead, Emily.
Go ahead, Emily.
Thank you. So my question is whether state strategies have the capacity to evolve over time with regards to the perception of third-party support. So Samir kind of touched upon this, but I'm not going to comment on what Pakistan's real involvement is in the current Kashmir conflict. That's touchy, difficult subject. But Kashmiris are always speaking out, as you know, about not wanting to internationalize their conflict.
Not wanting to internationalize? Okay.
Like about,
I just wanted to make sure I heard you right.
Yeah, not wanting to, in terms of saying that this is an indigenous struggle. They don't want.
I see what you're saying. Yeah.
They don't want it. They don't want India to see it as Pakistan's agenda. So my question is more of a hypothetical. Once betrayal is detected, like once a state detects a betrayal and that emotion is triggered, can separatists or secessionist movements come back from that perception? Like you noted how I think in Punjab that it actually escalated over time, but can the opposite also happen where where the perception of support is able, like where separatists are able to distance themselves from that perception?
Yeah, great question.
Great. So why don't you take a crack at them? Yeah.
All right, I'll go in order. So on the Kosovo question, there's 2 points, on international law and then sort of this norm of, so I'm reminded of, it's possibly apocryphal story, but I read it a bunch of times where like somebody asked Gandhi, what do you think about Western civilization? And he said it would be a good idea. And that's my approach to international law. Like when somebody says, what do you think of international law? I say it would be a good idea. And I'm a Chicago realist, and I don't like the fact that someone in Geneva or Brussels said something about Kosovo. I don't think really matters that much. I think the international system has these certainly this norm of self-determination, which is sometimes codified. But the international system also has a norm of territorial integrity and sovereignty, and that's really where we get this sort of tension, right? Where one norm, where the Wilsonian idea of self-determination, everybody should rule themselves, but also this post-World War II norm where borders are respected and don't break them up, and separatist groups are sort of caught in the middle of them. And I don't think it's a legal question. I think it's a political and military question, which leads me to this the second issue of why aren't it's a power and force argument. Why aren't you looking at the sovereignty of the people? It's not me. It's the state, right? I wish I was describing something different. If states behave differently, I'd have a different argument. So, don't blame me. Blame the states. I'm just saying what's happening. If something different was happening, I'd have a different argument. But the way I see it, you're totally right to note that world maps change, and that's fine. I get it, and I understand. I'm really trying to understand why states do not want the map to change, and that's all I'm saying, right? I'm not making a moral or ethical judgment on anyone's preferences or anything like that. On Emily's question, great question. Can strategies? So as soon as when you first asked it, I put down Armenia and Punjab because both went up. But you're totally right that at least in the empirical work, neither goes down. But I think theoretically there is space. I think theoretically I can make room for the argument that sometimes in the next iteration of the conflict, third-party support could be perceived as lower. I think that's fair. But in the empirical work, that hasn't happened. But again, I only have 6 or 7 cases in the book. But it's totally valid.
Tamanna, do you want to come to the defense of international law?
As a recovering international lawyer, my work in law school actually focused on non-state actors, but I agree with you. That's why I'm a recovering international lawyer and worked for the U.S. government for many years. Unfortunately, while in the 90s, I think with a resurgence of international law, the Kosovo verdict is actually one that is well cited and seen, but you can see that the politics of it actually, not only was it not respected, but in a post-9/11, in a terrorism world now, it is far the opposite. So forget secessionists or freedom fighters, now we call them terrorists, right? So the reality of the case is that Russia can argue that in Ukraine, but not in Chechnya. How powerful the state is in the international fora actually determines what name is going to be used for any of these anti-state actors. I like the word anti-state actors that you use because it's somewhat neutral, right? They are anti-state. And increasingly you will see that used, and if you read, the funny thing is if you are listening to the radio, as I often was in Islamabad, and then going to listen to the same story in New Delhi, you would hear freedom fighters and then terrorists, right? About the same people. And similarly, if you were talking about a different group, in Delhi they would be freedom fighters, and in Islamabad they would be terrorists. And I think this is a huge challenge for people who actually want to, as you said, respect the sovereignty of the people. So are there real grievances? And can we, as practitioners and policymakers, address those real grievances while actually dealing in a real world that has terrorism and national security challenges? And I think walking that fine line is a huge challenge. And as we internationalize conflicts, we make it, I think, you make it harder, and it's narrower for a state to actually find those solutions that don't lump people into the terrorist box.
Alec? I just want to try to rescue national sovereignty. So the gentleman noted that maps have changed, especially in Europe, but I would say that a lot of that happened during some very brutal, nasty violence, particularly in the interwar years and during World War II. And so I think the commitment to sovereignty is part of the reason why Alec points out that there's been a shift in the total amount of wars towards intrastate war rather than interstate war, in part because of at least some sense of border fixity post-45. Okay, so we've got, let's try to get a quick round of questions in. Let's make them really brief so we can get out of here by 2 o'clock. So we'll start with James, we'll go to Prashant, and that gentleman there.
Hi, how do you do? James Siebens. I'm a research associate with the Stimpson Center. First, I just wanted to underscore the last point about the importance of intrastate conflict, and that, to me, indicates that the sub-state threat environment may be equally, if not more important than the external threat environment, so that states that perceive likelihood of additional uprisings may be more concerned with suppression in the early stages or repression. And to that point, you talked about the potential for a slippery slope from state concessions to rebel groups. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the evidence from your research on how concessions can lead to additional demands, and whether or not state strategies of repression can be fairly compared to state strategies of concession from some of your work. As you know,
I didn't get that last bit. Can you?
So
I got everything else. Just that last bit.
Is it more effective in conflict resolution or preventing additional violence to make concessions versus repressing an uprising?
Okay, let's go to Prashant.
Thanks, Samir, and thanks for the great discussions. Prashant Parmaswaran with the Diplomat magazine. I had 2 questions for Ahsan, but also the panel. So the first is, I'm wondering, while you stated sort of the domestic variables initially as being one of the predominant factors and explanations other than the ones you advanced, even as your explanation has proven quite persuasive in these cases, I'm wondering, were there other cases maybe where you found that these domestic variables mattered more? And I'm trying to think of whether
There's one on the front pages of the newspapers every day. I'm glad no one's brought it up yet. Every time I give a talk on this book, somebody brings it up. I guess I'll bring it up today, but go ahead, finish your question.
And also, I'm just wondering, within the scope of your argument, whether there's room for some of these domestic variables as well. So, for example, when it comes to threat perceptions, particularly on external security, whether different institutions within the government may believe different things, particularly militaries in the case of South Asia, but also in other regions like Southeast Asia, there's often these civil military dynamics that determine how these perceptions arise. And then the second one is the case, I think, that was mentioned by several individuals here, including the panelists, the case of Sri Lanka and the LTTE. I mean, I think that really is the elephant in the room here, because you could argue it from different perspectives: organizational capability, domestic perceptions, external security. I'm wondering what your thoughts are on that, and perhaps the other panelists as well, what your comments are on that. Thanks.
Just handle it to the gentleman right behind you, Prashant. Last question.
Hi. I'm Mark Unger. I'm a student at Elizabethtown College. I just wanted to take a case study of India. Would it be possible to take the theoretical framework, possibly scale it down to national aid in Delhi to certain groups, and perhaps the likelihood of communal violence or ethnic tensions in explaining provincial separatism, like state to state, as in the Darjeeling issue last year from West Bengal, or the separation of North and Southern Tamil Nadu?
Okay.
So in other words, does the argument apply to intra-state? Got it.
You got them all?
I think I do.
All right, why don't you take a run at it, and then we'll.
All right.
Wow.
I'm going to leave the Sri Lanka one for you. All right, James. Can't read much. Sub-state environment versus international environment. So the argument, that sometimes states have to worry about potential dominoes is a dominant argument. Actually, in the literature, it's made by people like Monica Toft and Barbara Walter, two very senior political scientists. And the whole premise of my book is that they're wrong. So I guess what I would say is I think that's a reasonable argument theoretically, but I think it has a lot of trouble explaining variation empirically, especially variation within states. I think that argument is really good for explaining why state A might be different to state B, but I think that argument is really bad for saying why state A will treat groups X and Y differently, right? Which is problematic because the vast majority of separatist movements take place in what I call multiple movement states, where there's more than one movement. So I think it's a big issue. Concession versus repression, aren't you inviting, I took the subtext of your question to be, aren't you inviting more uprisings in the future when you repress? This is a really important critique of my work. I think it's totally reasonable to say when you are really harsh against a group of people, they will come back. They're not going to die down. I guess what I would say is, states are trying to live to fight another day in these situations. So if you employ sort of a realist, framework, especially when it comes to the shadow of the future, you want to take care of the here and now first. And then, yes, if they rise up again, we'll see what happens. But it's a reasonable point. When you hammer down on people, they get angry and they remember, right? Kashmiris today, the number of people, independent of my questioning, who I spoke to Kashmir, who brought up 1989 when I asked them stuff, is amazing. Anyway, so that's my answer to you. Prashant, other cases, Catalonia makes me look like an idiot because I predict that Spain is in a very peaceful post-security environment. It's the EU, nothing's happening, they should let it go. But they are not, right? Which makes me wrong, and it makes me very publicly wrong, which is why I don't like talking about it. Civil military dynamics. So that's really interesting. That's somebody, Paul Stananen, the guy on my dissertation committee, was pointing me in that direction. He says, you got to say something about the military role. The book is already 300 pages. The theoretical chapter is already 40 pages. As Alec noted, I try and pride myself in parsimony. I felt like adding these domestic variables, like domestic institutions and civil military stuff, might not buy me causal sort of analysis more than it's worth in terms of the parsimony lost. So I think you're right. I just don't put in the model, for reasons I just said. I'll leave the Sri Lanka and LTT question for you. And then on the last question, no. What I would say, I don't. Sorry. What I would say is, no, my argument does not extend that far. If you want to take it there, by all means. But I don't. So that could be, the one thing I would say is, when you're sort of splitting states, and that could be the tactical concessions that I'm talking about, where the state says, you're not going anywhere, but we can give you these, what I consider essentially meaningless concessions, where, all right, you get to have your own state within the state. I guess that's how I would think about it. But I don't think about it directly.
Very quickly, because I see we're running out of time on Sri Lanka. I was involved in the failed peace negotiations in 2004, pre-tsunami. I think what's important, and I would point you to Ahsan's book, is that he does argue that these conflicts are not monocausal, right? So I would argue that the international factor was part of the Sri Lanka conflict, but in no means, I think, can explain the whole of the conflict, especially given the 20-plus year history of the conflict. And you can see the height of perceived and actual Indian support was really in the 80s and maybe in the beginning of the 90s, and it dies down. And the most, what I would say, militaristic or the most regressive tactics were actually much later on, post-tsunami and the end of the war. So I think it doesn't necessarily line up exactly with yours, but it makes an interesting point that where you actually have a decreased perception and decreased reality of international support, it did not necessarily pull back the amount of violence used. So it actually, once a traitor, always a traitor, sort of in the LTTE case. So just to keep that a short answer. But I agree with you wholeheartedly. There are many, many different reasons, as in most of these conflicts, that lead to the actual secessionist cause.
Just add really quickly to that, Samir and I have talked about it, the problem, which is also a positive for the book, in that it does it, but studying strategy is quite hard because it is overdetermined.
Yes.
Absolutely
Yes.
everything contributes to strategy making. So I think that broader context is useful, and to the extent that we can chip away pieces of understanding strategy, that's a step forward.
All right, we've run past time as usual. I just want to thank Ahsan for presenting a fantastic book. You'll have an opportunity to purchase it after this event right here, and maybe Ahsan will sign some copies, who knows. Stay tuned for Alec's book, which I'm sure will be out soon, on some of the dynamics he's referring to about rebel cohesion and strength. And Tamanna, frankly, you should be writing a book on all the experiences and the number of negotiations you've been involved with. So thanks to the panelists, and thanks to you all for joining us today.